On May the 5th, 2002, a train conductor discovered something frightening on the train tracks near Philadelphia in the United States. It was a little electronic transmitter planted alongside the tracks. And as you could imagine, so shortly after 9/11, panic struck. The FBI were soon all gathered around the scene. Investigators discovered that the mysterious gadget was in fact a motion detector designed to send a signal to a nearby receiver. People were even more panic-stricken. Finally, a train mechanic stepped forward and admitted that he had installed the transmitter. It turns out that the mechanic was used to working during the night shift. And he had installed this motion detector to sound an alarm in his work area whenever his boss was approaching. That way he could safely take a nap during his night shift, and if the alarm went off, he could quickly get up, brush himself down, and look very busy for when the boss showed up. It is amazing what some people will do to try and get out of work. But sometimes as Christians, we can fall into the trap of living just like that. We would prefer to sit back on the night shift. We know that one day Jesus Christ is going to come again. But while we wait, we want to take a snooze. And I want to challenge you tonight. If you sense that you're beginning to feel sleepy as a Christian during the night shift, if you feel like you are just going through the motions with God in your life right now, God wants to give you a wake-up call tonight. In Exodus chapter 3, at the burning bush, Moses receives the call of God on his life, and it is a wake-up call that turns his entire life upside down. Nothing would ever be the same again for him. And I would want to suggest to you tonight that God's call on your life is just as strong as it was on Moses' life. The call to serve God with your whole heart is not a take-it-or-leave-it call. Serving God is not a kind of side issue in your life, popping up occasionally while you get on with the really important bits of your life, like studying for exams, or finding a job, or finding a spouse. God's call becomes the driving force of your life, the thing that gets you up in the morning, the thing that drives your actions and your attitude throughout the day, the thing that you measure your life by. And when Moses here hears God's call, it turns his whole life upside down. There's nothing held back. And that's what needs to happen in our lives as well. And in this passage, there are 4 things specifically that happen to Moses after he hears God's call. And these are the same 4 things that will happen in our lives if we are prepared to respond tonight to God's all-absorbing call on our lives. If you obey God's call tonight, firstly, this passage teaches us, you will become God's pilgrim. You'll become God's pilgrim. When Moses met with God at the burning bush, his life changed in an instant. Moses is 80 years old at the beginning of this passage. He is an aging man. He has spent the last 40 years of his life living in Midian, tending sheep. His simple desert life is quiet and straightforward. His family are all around him. He lives under the protection of his father-in-law Jethro. His finances are secure. Midian would be a great place to settle down, to live out his days, and retire in obscurity and comfort. But folks, living quiet, peaceful lives out of harm's way is not what we were made for. When we obey God's call, He sets our desires for comfort on fire. God calls Moses here out of his comfort zone to go back to the wasp nest that is Egypt. In verse 18, Moses realizes that obeying God's call means moving out from behind the protection of his father-in-law. He says to Jethro, let me go back to my people in Egypt. After 40 quiet years of shepherding sheep, God is raising the bar on Moses' life here and calling him to shepherd an entire nation and lead them out of slavery, as you'll know the story of the Exodus. And I want you to see here that God's call not only affects Moses' own protection and security, his family will be deeply affected as well. Verse 20 says Moses took his wife and his sons. He put them on a donkey and started them back to Egypt. You know, often many Christians stop responding to God's call around about the time that they find a husband or a wife. They find a family. We use the term settling down, don't we? And very often Christians just begin to settle down in their spiritual lives as well. This can happen, of course, when you're very young. I remember myself being quite a fiery young Christian when I was 16 or 17 years old. But then when university came, I moved from Larne, my little town in Northern Ireland, to Manchester. And I was much happier in university days just to blend in with the crowd. I even stopped going to church for a while. Mom and Dad weren't there to tell me to go to church. I was miles away from home. No one was watching what I was doing. I began to settle down in my Christian life. But that's not Moses' attitude here. Here is a man who obeys God and who takes his whole family with him into the cauldron that is Egypt, where his life is at risk. I mean, I wonder how Moses explained to his wife that they were going back. I mean, it was hardly a sane move in human terms. Moses was a fugitive from Egypt. He was known as a murderer. His wanted poster would have been up. You can imagine Zipporah, his wife, saying, "Hang on a minute, Moses. What about me? What about the kids? You need your head examined, man." And even God knows what a fearful prospect it is for Moses to return to Egypt. Verse 19, God has to reassure him, all the men who wanted you back in Egypt are dead. That's a good comfort, isn't it? While most men are having midlife crisis, Moses is having a midlife revival. He becomes a radical disciple suddenly, leaving Midian's comfort behind him to pursue God's will in the fires of Egypt. But folks, that's what happens. That's what it means to obey God's call in our lives. Moses has given up the safety first temptation of settled family life in Midian, and he has now become God's pilgrim. He goes back to Egypt with the staff of God in his hand. Moses has stopped being the reckless youth who felt he could change the world by murdering an Egyptian. He has given up the nice little kind of country life, if you like, in Midian, and he has now become God's pilgrim. His whole life is dictated by the call of God. There's no time to settle down. He is making a conscious decision to put comfort second and put God's call first. And he will leave Midian and he will take his family with him into Egypt because he is not living for any earthly reward. Like his ancestor Abraham, his life in this world is driven by the world to come. He is living for the heavenly city with rewards, whose builder and maker is God. And folks, I want you to ask yourself honestly today, is your life characterized by peace and security? Is that what you want from life? Are you prepared to go wherever God calls you, to do whatever He asks you to do, even if it messes with your dreams of a quiet life, fitting in with your friends, being one of the lads? Or could it be that your life is so set, your prospects are so fixed in your own mind that you stop listening to God's voice and the next challenge that He is calling you to? It can happen to any of us. We just become stale in our walk with God. The American evangelist Wilbur Chapman said, "It's not the ship in the water, but the water in the ship that sinks it." And in the same way, it's not the Christian in the world, but the world in the Christian that constitutes the danger. We just become stale. If there was a picture to describe your life tonight, would it be a pilgrim with the staff of God in his hand going into another adventure with God? Or would it be a holiday maker sitting on a recliner under a sun umbrella making sand castles? Jim Elliot, who was a Christian martyr, he died at 24 years of age bringing Bibles to the Auca tribe in South America. Jim Elliot famously said, "He is no fool who gives up what he cannot keep to gain what he cannot lose." And if we're listening to God's call in our lives tonight, God will be uncomfortable to live with. God constantly challenges us to set aside our stale, safe little lives